Hello, good morning, folks. We're going to get started a few minutes early so we have a little more time to have just some general discussion and exercises with these folks before we get started on our luncheons, okay? I'm Walt Zabritsky. I'm a board member of PPX and been involved with this organization. Have been organizing some of the past symposiums and happy to be engaged in any way possible for the next little while. I've got my great pleasure to be introducing these three gentlemen, and what I'd like to tell you is that this is kind of an extraordinary event that we're having because this is the first time we have featured a subject on ethics in our symposiums, as to my memory, and it's a very important subject. And we believe that this is an important area for all of us to be involved in and to be aware of. And we're currently working with the ethics practitioners of Association of Canada, thank you, to partner with them to help them promote their program and agenda, and for them to help us get some exposure among their clientele and their membership as well. And so we've got 1 hour, so I'm going to do a very short intro on the three gentlemen that are going to be talking to you. And Robert Czerny is this gentleman right here, and he's with the past president of the Ethics Practitioner Association of Canada. And he was a mathematician. He studied mathematics, humanities, and philosophy. And he's been working in the federal government for about 20 years. And about 20 years ago, he started his own consulting practice, Agora Management. And he's been active in a whole variety of areas, including organizational change, partnership, program evaluation, surveys, communications, editing, and ethics. He's been a volunteer board member of the Ethics Practitioners Association of Canada for a long time, I think since 2011, and he served as president from 2013 to 2018 and recently retired from that position. Ben Poe has been working for, he's a senior values and ethics advisor. And he's been working for Employment and Social Development Canada for the past 25 years. And he has been involved in setting up the department's Office of Values and Ethics. Currently, he's a special advisor with the Ethics Office and provides guidance, advice, training on public sector values, ethics, code of conduct, conflict of interest, harassment prevention, civility, values-based management, ethical leadership principles, ethical risk management, and disclosure of wrongdoing. That was a mouthful, but a lot on your plate then. And last but not least, Art. My partner in crime on the PPX board here. He's been a long-term member of the Planning and Performance Exchange, has served as president at one time of this organization and as a treasurer, and he's currently running our learning events. Now, he's currently works as an independent consultant and in the areas of governance, performance measurement, controllership, audit, and HR. And with further ado, I'm going to let you go. You should be aware of this session, as select sessions are being recorded for us to put up on our website. We felt this one was particularly interesting and useful for all of our larger community. Anyway, thank you for your patience, and good luck, gentlemen.
Good luck. Thank you very much. My name is Robert. I will be starting us off. For those of you who came late, here's a couple of words about me, and you'll see the same about Ben and Art. So I am going to introduce things with some general overview of values and ethics, and then Ben Poe will talk about how that plays out in the federal government, in terms of legislation and so forth, and what are the typical services and offices that you might run into. And then finally, Art will transition over into the application in results-based management and the other topics that are of interest to people who come to PPX events, which leads me to ask, who here is in the room because of a particular role or interest in ethics? Well, that's a fair number of you. And so the rest of you, I suppose, are in various sorts of corporate planning, measurement, reporting. How many are those? And so anybody put up their hand for both? Like, oh, good. Okay, well, that's excellent, because this is what we want to delve into. I've known Art and Ben in different contexts for quite a few years. And with Art and Walter, we talked about the desire within this community to pay more attention to the ethical side. And so we figured that this trio might help to do that. What you're going to see is a very, very brief introduction. What I'm going to present now would really disgust my colleagues in the ethics area as being way, way too short. And even what I have here, I'm going to go through some of it quickly, but you'll find it on the PPX website in the recording. But by all means, this is only a very, very brief introduction, and you ought to go further and delve further into it. One of my inclinations is to try to demystify the area. It's not esoteric. As human beings, we're making decisions all the time. And some of them are just technical decisions. Am I going to have the coffee or the smoothie? That's really no big deal. But in terms of a lot of the other sorts of things, a young man got up and gave me his seat today on the bus. And I thought, oh, well, he must be getting off pretty soon. He went really far. Fortunately, he found another seat. Okay? You're always making decisions about how to behave yourself, how you want the world to be, and so forth. That's because we're human beings. I'm interested in the issues around artificial intelligence, robotics, and ethics. And to me, the key difference is that the robots don't know how to exercise discretion. Okay? That's, for me, a key takeaway. As human beings, we're exercising discretion all the time. And if we're upset at somebody else, one of the things that goes through our mind is, oh, come on, use your head. Okay? Come on. Yeah, that's the rule. But don't you know how to apply a rule? Don't you know how to figure out what the situation really is? Don't you know how to make the thing really work? Some of the things that our first speaker today touched on were of that sort. So values are the beliefs that influence our decisions, and ethics refers to behavior. Sometimes we get hung up. Is it ethics or is it morality? Is it morals? Who cares? All right. What it really comes down to is that both ethics and morality come from the same sorts of roots. What is our society all about, or our group all about? What's the ethos that we have, that we share? What are our mores? If you think of ethos and mores, then you don't have to think of either a philosopher somewhere, dead or alive. You don't have to think about a deity. Just think of our society. Now, our society may be influenced by religious beliefs. It may be influenced by secular great perspectives, like Confucianism is not is of that sort. Fine. That's the ethos. That's the mores. Start at that point. And that says, this is how we really want things to operate when they're working well. So this is one of the slides I'll go through rather quickly. It influences how we're seen externally. It also influences how we feel as members of an organization. And the stated values of an organization tell people what to expect of it. And it also very much influences how people feel inside, how they're, whether they feel right about working with an organization, whether they feel motivated to do their work well, and of course, whether that organization will be well regarded outside. You know, will people actually try yet again to phone Service Canada, or what? You know, that came up earlier today. Did you want to say something on just on that point, Ben?
Sure. So we view that values and ethics are essential well, from a public service perspective, in a line department, yeah, ethics are essential, right? Every employee should have a certain set of values dictated by the Values and Ethics Code, for example. So you have a common place to start with, right? And there are dividends that are gained from having ethics in the organization, right? Such as increased engagement of employees, they perform better, there's less stress when you have behavioral expectations, for example, right? Yeah.
Okay, good. We'll keep going. So, from the negative side, ethical failure, well, mistrust, loss of social license to operate, and social license nowadays with social media around, it's really, really tricky. Of course, there's very concrete issues like fines, imprisonment, injury, deterioration of society, deterioration of the environment, all sorts of consequences of lack of ethics in behavior. And one bunch in particular that I added here, because so many of you are public servants, their career implications. And unfortunately, people who try to do the right thing and are surrounded by colleagues who don't feel the same way, that person is made to feel uncomfortable. And I'll leave it at that mild description. Ben just talked about workplace harmony or lack thereof, and of course, political consequences. Governments rise and fall around issues like sponsorship and so forth. And Ben gave me an example of just putting it in dollars and cents terms. The chief financial officer for Volkswagen calculated the costs of $6.25 billion in 2018 for their decision to kind of monkey around with their emissions information. So this next slide is the key one in terms of kind of the framework that I want to propose that you think of, and that then Ben's presentation will fit into. So there's professional ethics, and you're very aware of, you know, the legal profession has its ethics, medical profession, and so on. And the public service has its ethics too, and as Ben will explain, there is a general code of being a public servant. But of course, if you're an engineer in the public service, or if you're an accountant within the public service, then you have professional in two senses, and sometimes they conflict. The capital P professionalism of an engineer with the iron ring can conflict with what the department wishes. The department says, you know, sign this off, it's good enough, and the person would say, well, maybe as a public servant it's good enough, but as an engineer, no, I can't. So there's the professional side. Then there's what I call general organizational ethics, which is not always talked about within those specific codes for engineers and so forth. But in order for an organization to function, you have to have things like respect and diversity and fairness and honesty and so forth. In my 21 years experience in the federal government, 2/3 of the time I was a manager, and so I was hiring people and so forth. And yeah, I went through all of the things that were de rigueur, but the first two things I looked for in a candidate was integrity, because somebody who's not honest, who's not straightforward, is going to ruin whatever you do. You know, if it's a contractor who lacks integrity, I'll watch the contract very, very carefully. But a team member who lacks integrity, no, I don't want them around. And the second thing I wanted in a team member was generosity of spirit, because selfish team members just ruin the atmosphere. Okay, it makes it hard to work together. As far as I'm concerned, those are especially the latter, is not something that you're going to find in specific codes, but it's utterly essential. The third thing I looked for was intelligence, because whatever I hired somebody for, they'd have to do something else in 6 months, and you know they had to learn it. So anyway, So the typical approaches to ethics commitments, you get statements of values, and I've put an up arrow because that tends to set an ideal. You know, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Be honest, et cetera, et cetera. Those sorts of values set a high ideal, but at the same time, you can have. This thing is funny. It goes much faster than I thought. But at the same time, you can have codes which set out rules, norms, and standards, and that I use that terminology to talk about the bare minimum. Well, I shouldn't say bare minimum, but it's the minimum requirement. It's the line that an organization it feels strongly about, such that if you cross that line, there has to be some sort of negative consequences. At least it'll appear in your performance appraisal. At least you should get some training or coaching or time off or something or other. It can be more serious than that too, of course. But organizations have lines that they don't want people to cross, but at the same time, they have lofty goals, lofty ideals. So I think that in your work, you should be aware of both of those dimensions. Some of the kind of the hard line of minimum expectations, but also the ideals that are set that would make us an excellent organization, a greater contributor to the common good. You know what? I think there's a timer in this thing. Excuse me, is there a timer thing in that? No? Oh, okay, well, you know what? I'll use the back thing. Okay, so yeah, so compliance or aspirations, we get those debates in the ethics organization, and I think it's realistic to say that you need both. Is this imposed or is it organically growing within the organization? By having this kind of discussion, you're trying to grow it organically rather than have some office somewhere impose it. Ongoing and pervasive, a dialogue among people who want to strive for this versus just a special office somewhere or an occasional project. This is a good point to turn it over to Ben. There, now there's something on it.
Okay, thanks. So here we start getting into ethics and measurement. Well, how we measure ethics performance in line departments, and it's largely driven by what we call the Management Accountability Framework exercise, the annual exercise by Treasury Board Secretariat to measure how deputy ministers are performing. And this started many years ago, 15, 16 years ago, I think, as a way to answer the question, well, we know that departments and the chief executive, we know that they're doing their work, right? And they have a list of results every year, what they've done. But there was a question that went unanswered and was, well, how do we measure the integrity of the leader or the chief executive? And that's what drove the creation of the Management Accountability Framework. And so over the years, they asked questions every year to each department as to, okay, what have you done, for example, in your ethics program, and we report on that, and then you're assessed on that every year. So that's a big driver for measurement of ethics whoops. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I'll keep going. So as far as policies and legislation that also is behind an ethics program, again, very strictly from the context of the federal government of Canada, we have an act, the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act, which is the first act that I've seen that actually has the word ethics in it, right? And it required us to create the code of conduct and to make sure we promote ethical behavior, and so that's good to have that piece of legislation. And then, of course, Treasury Board came out with the Values and Ethics Code as a guide for behaviors, and then every department is also required to produce their own code of conduct. So then, of course, we get to measurement, which we'll cover probably in the next few slides.
No, well, this is, it's not bad. The last point there was a response to crisis, and I think that going back historically, the period of Sponsorship Act and Montgomery Inquiry came into all this drive for the Accountability Act and so forth. I have to go back to that.
Good point, right?
Yeah. Typical scope. Are you on the next one now?
Yeah, let's go to the next one.
Well,
Oh, did you want me to speak more about that?
no, not necessarily.
Well,
Whatever you like.
ethics in general, right? If you think about it, if you look at the history, a lot of the things that we do, not everything, but a lot of it is driven by something bad that happens, right? And then all of a sudden we decide, oh, well, there was a gap there, we need to do something, right? And it can go the other way. So if nothing happens for 10 years, all these controls that you put together when something blew up 10 years ago, they start to weaken too. So if you're in the ethics program and also in the measurement program, like these are some of the things that we need to keep a watchful eye for, right? Like good news is not always really good for sustaining mechanisms or control measures. All right. Just to get into a little bit of what a typical ethics office might go through. Different departments and agencies, generally when we talk values and ethics or an ethics office or an ethics program, they're usually based on two key documents. The Values and Ethics Code for the public sector, and then their departmental or agency code of conduct. So that ethics office takes care of anything that's related to those two documents, right? Whether it's training, learning, measuring behaviors sometimes, or keeping track of breaches or misconduct. Some offices do that. And then in our department, we also then, of course, just look after all conflict of interest issues or cases. We, of course, also look after whistleblowing or disclosure of wrongdoing, because that's our enabling act. That involves, as needed, investigations.
There we go. There's the timer thing.
And then I've also found that in other departments, these offices can be located in various offices. It's not always going to be in HR. It's not always going to be in finance. In some departments or agencies, they're with the audit office. And some departments, they have an ombuds office. So depending on where the chief executive wants that office to be, that's where it goes. But the functions are kind of very similar. The core are very, very similar. Also from experience, and this isn't really a negative, but it's just, I find it a little humorous, that there are certain functions or perhaps legislation that the department or an organization finds that, well, this doesn't really fit anywhere and nobody else wants it. Okay, it goes to the ethics office. So that sometimes happens. Not necessarily a bad thing, right? For example, the Lobbying Act.
Should I go on next?
All right, I think we're good for that slide.
Okay. Fine.
Okay, this is now going into a little bit of how we measure ourselves as an ethics program. So within our department, of course, there's always going to be that minimum standard that we want to try and meet the expectations set out by Treasury Board in the Management Accountability Framework, right? And as you know, in measurement, they always say, right, whatever you measure is what gets done, right? So that's, we look at it as the minimum. And the way I view it, that's a great measure with the math. And for a large part, the way that math measures is the presence or absence of something. How many here have dealt with math? All right, everyone. Okay, of course, measurement, right? But from the ethics perspective, the questions that they ask is, well, do you have this or do you not, right? And if you have it, well, good for you, right? Isn't it that simple? Yeah, there you go. And in fact, I've heard colleagues in other departments say, yeah, well, what evidence have we got this year? Is this mathable, right? So that, I love that word, mathable. It's mathable, right? Now, mathable, yeah. So a few years into the ethics program, I'd say about 5 years ago, we got to a stage where there was a little bit of turmoil going on in the ethics world. I would like to think that ethics officers were doing a great job in the federal government, and that resulted in a bit of a dilution of how we measure ethics. They rolled values and ethics, which was its own area of management or measurement, the very first one, right? They rolled it into people management. Yeah. In my view, okay, we're still there, but it's almost diluted because you don't see it as a subtitle anymore. That said, good thing it's still there. So with that, also with the challenge that we also started to sense that we were, in my view again, I could be challenged on this. In my view, we were starting to exceed the expectations from the math exercise. And we needed to start finding a way, a better way to measure our performance, right? So in addition to just having something in math or not, we developed a maturity model. And within that maturity model, we have the 4 elements right there. How are we doing in leadership, hardwiring, accountability, and organizational development? And then for each of these elements, what level of maturity are we at? Are we at the basic, like we're just all about compliance and following the rules? Or are we a bit more managed and sustainable? Can we consistently do this? Or is this a one-shot deal? Let me clarify that one-shot deal. It's more in reference to the amount of money that you get. So in certain years, I mean, we're lucky if we get an additional infusion of funding. So you can't really rely on that, right? And if the ethics program relies on that bonus, or it's like winning the lottery, counting on that for your pension, it just isn't sustainable. So that's not really a mature program if that's your source of funding. And then the highest level of maturity, we believe, is that you are effective. At the same time, you're still continuously striving to improve. So that's kind of how we're trying to measure ourselves in addition to the math exercise.
Thank you. Before I hand it over to Art, I'd just like to emphasize something here. In my experience on the board of EPAC and helping set up the workshops and then the webinars that we do over, well, since 2010, 2011, I think the theme that comes up most consistently has to do with leadership. And when you interrelate that with the maturity model, it basically comes down to this aphorism: are you just paying lip service to something? Or is it really being anchored into the organization, or hardwired, as you put it? And in two senses, are people actually walking the talk? Is there a consistent view that this is actually what is wanted? And that then means that you're not just at the levels 1 and 2 there of maturity, but it's gone beyond it to being managed and routine and so forth, up to and including continuously improving. How do we continuously improve the understanding that employees have and that management has, that these are the ideals to be pursued? But the leadership and going beyond the lip service, the code on the wall. Yeah, we've got the code on the wall, and that's mathable, right? As you said, is key. So over to Art. Thank you. I'll press the magic button.
So I'd like to shift gears just a little bit, and maybe get a microphone too, and talk to you a little bit about some some ideas and thoughts that I've had in the opportunity to work with Bob and Ben on this session today about what all that you've just heard might mean for your work in results-based management, I use the term broadly, and for a way to think about ethics as it applies all over the place when you think about doing good work in results-based management, or you can call it, the gentleman this morning talking about Impact Canada. I mean, that comes up instantly when you think about how they might be approaching their work too. So a couple of particular things I want to do this morning. One is to talk about a little bit about the connection, what that connection is, meaning in a definitional sense, and then to talk a little bit about some of the typical ethical challenges and dilemmas that at least I've seen come up, and you may recognize a number of them as you hear about them. And then lastly, on a I guess a positive note, some possible strategies that can be used to address those ethical dilemmas and come out the other side with a healthier organization, healthier institution, or indeed healthy groups and individuals. And right away, I want to posit to you that in order to try to get some structure in terms of the overall framework for how it applies to results-based management, I would encourage you to think about 3 levels, if you will. And they interact with each other, but there's the institutional level where you're talking about Parliament, say. There's an organizational level, your departmental organization. And then there's a 3rd level where you're talking about groups and individuals. Ethics is there at all those levels. Ethical dilemmas is there at all those levels. And so is results-based management. So let me explain a bit more. Next slide, please.
Oops.
Jumped ahead,
Whoops.
right?
Yeah, because the damn thing did. Here we go.
I think the majority of this group knows all of its definitions and all of the elements of results-based management backwards and forwards. So I'm not going to redefine that for you. I will apologize for those that work more in the values and ethics area, but I think in the interest of time, you can take a look at the words that are on there. The essence of what I want to posit to you is that, and it's something that I think that we in the public service maybe have in mind most of the time, try to practice it most of the time, succeed most of the time, but some of the time we don't. And that's the question that I have in the 3rd bullet. How results are achieved matters. I think that that is something that maybe that we've wandered a little bit away from in terms of our work in the public service, even though we all may be very well aware of it and want to do our very best. But again, I'm going to try to offer some examples of where things have gone wrong, some ethical dilemmas, and some ways in which some of those ethical dilemmas can be solved in a practical fashion. Next slide, please. So here's what I'm going to say. I put down on this page some things that I think that can go off the rails in terms of causes of ethical dilemmas. I'll bet if you think about it for another minute or two, you could probably double the list, and I would encourage you to do that now or when we get into the discussion session of part of this session. We're also going to give you a chance to work with a particular scenario where you can think through some of those dilemmas and how you might solve them, particularly in terms of an individual level kind of problem. These things that we're looking at here can range from very subtle things, using parts of a performance in order to tell an incomplete performance story that slants the readers or the viewers or the audience's intention towards a more positive perspective on what they're seeing. I'm going to give you some examples in a minute. That's just one subtle form of how you can be dealing with an ethical dilemma. And perhaps in your work as an analyst or manager, you've come across that kind of situation. All the way from there, again, in the interests of time, to outright fraud that's being committed that maybe or you are or are not aware of, or your organization is or is not aware of, but in fact there's an illegal activity going on. There's theft, and that theft could be in the form of time, money, or any other kind of resources, but it is going along, and the question is, not only what do you do about it, but what does the organization do about that? What does the institution do about that? Next slide, please.
You know what? Let's just stop here for a second. I'd like to make one very brief observation and then ask a question. The observation is that you can have all sorts of problems, but they're not all particular to this, one runs into the issue of careerism, where people are motivated by their own wish for a promotion and security and so forth, and therefore they do blah, blah, blah. Well, careerism per se, I wouldn't say has to do with results-based management dilemmas. That's just a more general one. And that's why earlier on in that slide I said there's general organizational issues and not just professional ones. Here's my quick question. You've had enough time and you've listened to Art on this. Is there anything missing from this slide? Top of mind? And if you put up your hand, we know that you did it. No, sorry. It's not an admission. Yeah? Is it, what would you say?
I just want to say that fraud is intentional, but it doesn't have to involve just finance.
Okay, fraud is intentional, but doesn't have to just involve finance?
If you mislead the public on the performance of a program deliberately, that's fraudulent reporting.
Okay, fraudulent reporting as, yeah.
That's what I'd like to add to that slide.
Okay, good. Anything else? Okay, can you go to that?
Sure, I have a bunch of bags. in the
Oh,
back.
okay. Well,
Go ahead, you can hear.
Well, it's kind of covered, I guess, under selective measurement, but I would maybe add one of the issues that I often see is with target selection or with benchmarking. Often what's selected is what's easiest rather than what's best, and that's often crosses an ethical line in my view.
that's right. One sees those debates when you talk to evaluators, and they're trying to decide whom to interview and all that sort of stuff.
So absolutely right.
I would just add to that and say choosing indicators that make you look good, not necessarily what the reality of the situation is.
Okay, selective measurement, distorted indicators, right?
Yep.
And I think that the term low-hanging fruit is exactly what she's talking about, because yes, it's good to go for a quick success, but sometimes that's all we go for.
Low hanging fruit, that's an excellent one to add. Okay?
Thank you.
One more.
Just another one which may or may not be an elephant in the room is basically, I work in the policy field and really close to our political masters. And off and on, that's the interaction that happens between the political level and the public service level is very prone to very real and challenging ethical dilemmas, mainly from the public sector perspective, even though at times at the political level that has to be
Yeah, so-
the ultimate price in the election.
So the gentleman is saying that the pressure often comes from the political level. The minister's office wants blah, blah, blah. Okay? And I think that's where, on the earlier slide where I talked about the professionalism of the public service, the Tate report was a document in 1996 that set out kind of a framework for thinking about public service values and ethics. And that really spells out the dilemma of public servants working for the public, and at the same time respecting the legitimate exercise of authority of the duly elected government. And the relationship needs to be proper on both sides. Enough said.
So thank you for those comments. That's helped improve the slide right there, and I'm sure we could keep on working on it. Let's move on to the next slide. What I want to do now is to take 3 examples, one of which is a case study for everyone here to think about, but 2 of which are actually based on things that did happen, and talk to you about some observations about how some of these systemic issues and ethical issues in results-based management can play out, including in the public realm. I should also point out here that despite the fact that I'm trying to say there's 3 different levels involved in here, you can also find readily that the cases involve mixtures of everything. In fact, the one I'm going to talk to you about now, it had everything in it, but I'm going to say to you that it had the added dimension that it was taking place at the political and institutional level that I think made it a little bit unique. So everyone's heard about Gomery. I don't know how much you know about Gomery or how much you need to know about Gomery, but I think the essential characterization that is important to know about here is that through whistleblowing, through investigative journalism, and through other forms of public query, it became evident that there was at least some degree of undue political interference in how the program got created, how it operated, and how it accounted for itself. There were several issues involving very large sums of money that were distributed with absolutely a worthwhile cause of Canadian unity, but in fact, the program did in fact go astray. And it went astray not only at the political level, but also at the program management level. And in fact, people were held at kind of both levels. But I want to focus on, again, that kind of systemic response to try and address something once it's become evident at an institutional level that there's been an ethical lapse at that institutional level. And here I'm talking about the operation of government and of parliament. Then the kind of thing that can happen is what we saw in this particular case. And even though it's been a good 12 years, 13 years since it happened, I think we're still seeing the implementation of some of these systemic remedies play out. Again, you can make your judgments about how effective they are, but it did happen. And here I'm talking about through the guise of the Federal Accountability Act that was implemented by a new government. And by the way, what happened with the previous government, I think its fall can objectively be largely attributed to what happened in this particular instance. But the new government chose to implement a fairly comprehensive set of measures designed to ensure that this kind of systemic ethical failure did not happen again. And here you see the list of some of them. I haven't included them all. The biggest one is the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, and there was also some strengthening of the mandates and roles of the ethics and lobbying commissioners, and also with the Comptroller General as well. All of those things, I think, they can be debated. We haven't had a program evaluation of them per se. We've had some audit work done on some of them, but I think they, for example, when you talk about the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, again, we can debate anything, but its operation in the case of SNC Lavalin would appear to have been appropriate in order to maintain the boundary between what the government might have wanted to do or see happen in a particular case and what was judged to be appropriate underneath the law and the mandate of PPSC. So that kind of measure can actually operate to institutionally change behaviors so that, in fact, maybe not eliminate, but you can certainly reduce the chances of that kind of ethical lapse. I'll give you another kind of example that comes from my work as being advisor to the Comptroller General of Canada. And it's another part of the strengthening of this. Previous to the Federal Accountability Act, the Comptroller General of Canada was not its own job. It was rolled in with the Secretary of the Treasury Board's job description. With this act, it was separated out, given its own office, organization, mandate, and resources, with the power to deal with ethical lapses, particularly in controllership. And in one particular instance here, I'm making a general reference to it here, but there was in fact a deputy minister who was actually doing time and money theft from his own office. There was an internal audit conducted by the Comptroller General's office. I was involved in it. We found out about that theft, and that deputy minister was removed from office. I'm using those blunt terms advisedly. You might have heard about this story in some other way, but that's what happened in this case. And it happened because the Comptroller General was structurally given the authority in order to be able to deal with this kind of ethical lapse. And again, it's an example of something working, obviously, here. I'm doing my own form of cherry picking, I know that. You can come back at me during the conversation that there's plenty of other examples where things didn't work. I know we're dealing, like, for example, with the Mark Norman case and what happened there. We can make the argument the other side. Looking at this positively, though, I think overall these kinds of institutional changes can work in order to help to prevent ethical failures. So you can think about, more of this kind of thing. And certainly if we have some time, I'd like to get your ideas about what other structural things you think could help Canadians face fewer ethical dilemmas when you think about it at the institutional level. But I gotta move on, sorry. The next example is hopefully something that you instantly relate to. I would think a lot of you have been in government for some time, or at least a little bit of time. And we've had the jokes about Maffable, and also you know about RBM and about DRRs and DPs, and 400 other acronyms that you do when you do your planning and performance measurement and reporting and evaluation and so on kind of work. The example I want to talk about here, and again, I want to be clear that it's neither one thing or another. I'm presenting to you a positive aspect of a case where an organization chose to use an opportunity of a change in its status from being a regular public service department to becoming an alternative service delivery agency, a separate employer, to actually address some of its performance problems, including problems of balance and a lack of ethicality in the way it was going about its planning and reporting in order to make honest improvements in what it was doing. And I'm just commending that to you. It's too little time to really give you a lot of the details of this case, but if you ever want to know more about it, I'm around and you can talk to me about it. But to me, here we're in the territory where you deal with something like this, where you're having problems with your reporting. The Auditor General is on your back. Parliament's asking a lot of piercing questions about why the money is going in a certain way and you don't see the results, and you respond to it using an RBM approach. And you know these elements here: a strategic framework, maturity models, defined expected outcomes and results, solid performance indicators, honest, balanced performance storytelling. That's a really key one here. What I'm talking about here is that we can all think about examples when we go about our planning and reporting where we stick in what we expect from a particular strategic objective or reporting upon the program's performance in a DRR, where we say, well, here's all the positive things we achieve, and then we say, well, there's a little thing over here, but we're working on it. Well, that's not what I would term to be balanced reporting. Balanced reporting is where you're giving a more fulsome context for what the program was expected to achieve. We'll use that example, how it's doing according to objective criteria. Again, I know you know this territory, but you're talking about also not only successes, but areas of weakness. Those areas include what you don't know, where the measurement is weak, and they also include what you plan to do about that. I call that a performance improvement plan. Call it what you will, but that kind of concept can really help to address a lack of balance in performance reporting, and I think increase the reputation of an organization as being an honest, transparent, and balanced organization that is dealing effectively with its obligations in a way in which its mastery of RBM serves a positive purpose. Again, what does this mean for you? Well, I think this is your work. I think what you do here matters greatly, and you can positively influence what goes on in your organization in order to address some of these ethical dilemmas, such that maybe you can't win them all, but I think you can solve some of them. And I think it's using your minds and your talents to think of different ways to measure things, to add things to measure, add measurements, and indicators that don't have to cost an arm and a leg. Think about these kinds of things. As again, our PCO speaker said, you don't have to commit out front. Engage, talk to people, seek the views of your program colleagues and others within the organization about what the problems are, and maybe together you can work on solutions in order to be able to address some of these things. I'm saying too much here right now, but again, I hope I give you a flavor for how you might address this using RBM in an honest kind of approach. I'm going to turn things back now to Bob.
Well, you had your individual slide.
Oh, yeah, sorry, pardon me. I've got a little bit more to go before it turns back to Bob. All right.
Okay, I'll take over.
When it gets down to what your job is, I think we heard it here before. You know, you have political masters and you have bureaucratic masters, and you can only take your concerns about what you do and how you're doing it so far. I still believe there's room for a measure of truth to power in the public service. And I continue to believe that, and I think it's part of your responsibility, part of our responsibility to exercise that capability whenever that you can. You may not be able to do it always, but I think pointing out that there's an error in a report and it can be fixed, and here's the answer to how it fixes, is an appropriate thing to do. It may be uncomfortable to do it, but I think that this is part of the job of being a true public servant working for Canadians. no doubt you need to have support, and there's plenty of those supports, and Bob and Ben have talked quite a bit about that. I think I would just simply add to it that having an effective HR regime that actually works, that's got some other ingredients that I think have not really come up yet this morning, which is such things as a good labor relations organization and conflict management, conflict resolution are important other instruments that can help in order to be able to deal with some of those individual problems that you have. Above all, if you go at your work with the mindset that you are involved in dialogue, that you are aiming for trust, that you are looking for positive compromise, those are the features that I think can get you quite far in terms of being able to deal with some of these individual dilemmas. They won't solve them all. I'm not Pollyanna or Pollyanna-im, but they will help you, I think, greatly in terms of doing this. So, back to Bob, case studies. Thank you.
So, we've got about 15 minutes left, and what I'm going to describe to you now is a summary of a case study of about a page and a half from the work of an American expert in this area named Dr. Mary Gentile, whose approach is called Giving Voice to Values. Based on a good deal of organizational and psychological research, her finding was that people very often know what they ought to do, but feel conflicted and somehow lacking in skill, just like an athlete who hasn't practiced enough would feel during a game. Okay, when you're in the situation, that's no time to start figuring out how to speak up. And so giving voice to values is a very interesting practice in how to become comfortable with speaking your mind when it's important to do so. So this is one of the cases on her website, and we'll be doing the full case in a month's time in a webinar in our organization. So I chose the name Joe, so it's not assuming that it's a male or female. This is a person who's a rising star, second in command of controllership in an industrial products company, pressured, who's experiencing pressure to record restructuring charges as favorably as possible. And Joe looks at this, and from a professional viewpoint of accounting practices, knowing the norms, figures that this is extremely aggressive accounting that is actually misrepresenting the situation to anybody who cares to really know. However, nobody's going to end up in jail. So what should Joe do? Well, there's pressure from other people, particularly from more senior and veteran members of the company, who say, look, this is good for the company, and by the way, it'll be good for your career. You're a rising star, and you have to show that you know how to make the right decision in these difficult circumstances. So let's see how you do. Well, Joe's internal voice is not too happy. Joe's disappointed and worried. He or she joined this company because it had a lot of integrity, and thought that these were really the values. But maybe there's been willful blindness. Maybe I've missed what's really going on. Maybe this is typically what happens, and I just haven't been able to see it. But I don't want to belong to that kind of organization. I want to make it better. But if I try to do something about it, if I resist now, will I still have a job? Or I might still have a job, but I won't rise up to where I want to get. But let's look at it the other way around. Maybe the higher you go, the less real influence you have, because then you're co-responsible for the shareholder value and all that. Maybe now's the time to speak up rather than later. So what we'd like to do, we still have about 15 minutes. So for 5 minutes, we'd like you to just, some of you turn around a bit and get in groups of 3, 4, or 5, and just think for 5 minutes, what should Joe do at this point? What's the right thing? And if you want to translate it into a public service, a public sector context, I purposely did not choose a public sector one because I didn't want to get too specific about the kind of factors. But I think that this maps to the whole issue of pressure. As a matter of fact, when we first proposed this session, we called it Honest Results Reporting, Inappropriate Pressure, and Public Service Ethics. Then we toned down our title a little bit. But at that point, well, at least I was trying to have a bit too much fun with it. So please discuss it for just a few minutes. Yeah?
Are you going to expect people to respond and to make reports on this?
We'll expect you to respond, but we're not going to ask everybody or every little grouping to do something. That would be too much.
Voluntary basis.
Yeah, whoever would like to, okay? Just talk among yourselves. Let's get to it.
I'm not going to try to go around.
Yeah, I'll probably say hello to a few people that I was surprised they're here.
Ben. Let's just take a few comments. Is this a time for Joe to update the CV or what? Yeah, over there. Stand. Go to the mic.
Our first instinct was to go to them and say, why? Why is it important that you have this reported favorably? And then the second point was, what impact does this have on the stakeholders and the company and anybody else involved in it? And that would open up the possibility for us to listen to that gut feeling to either make a good decision or this decision to go ahead and do it based on that, or at least make the decision to say, you know what, I'm really uncomfortable with this and I can't do this.
Thank you. One quick comment on that. Your second point about impact on stakeholders and on the company and so forth. One of the classical approaches when people with philosophical expertise and ethics get into this sort of stuff talk about, well, fancy term is consequentialism, consequences, results. So look at the concrete impacts and then work backwards. I think that it still comes down to the values that you've decided on, but really pay attention to the practical consequences. Some other comment?
Hi there. Oh.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Go ahead.
Okay,
And then one more.
Yeah, so we talked as well about the consequences, but first step was kind of to understand who was asking for what, and to really ensure that we had a good conversation about those consequences. Because sometimes, like for example, I'm guessing the person from the senior management may or may not be understanding, may not be an accountant, for example, may not have really a full sense of what the implications. So to actually, in a calm way, before we jump to a conclusion like, whoa, is to actually walk through what it would mean, maybe to even propose some options of like other ways that might achieve similar story being told, but not in a way. Also, I'd have to identify, I'm guessing it's my supervisor, where my comfort zone is after that conversation. And then to decide what's the next step here. So if I've set a line where I'm not comfortable to do X or Y, how are we going to get through this? And it depends on the company and the governance, whether there's official channels or we bring in a supervisor, but it's very delicate. We talked if it's private industry, you could be just fired. Yep. So it depends on kind of what are the structures in place. You know, is there a public accounting that happens anyway, or a third-party accounting that could be part of your kind of contingencies, that there's other checks and balances that this just won't fly. And also to talk about the standards, whether it's for the accounting standards or, you know, those generally acceptable principles, so that it's a clear understanding.
You notice the interplay of the capital P values and principles as an accountant, you know, which are well established, and then the interplay with the broader issue about being upright and professional within the company.
I can just quickly add to what you just said. Part of talking about what the consequences are is to poke at the question of who's going to be looking at this report afterwards. It could be an external review by an auditor, and you could be in worse difficulty pursuing this path. So knowing the consequences may cause the person to change their mind.
Get one more comment, Mary? Yeah, thanks.
So we kept it at a much higher level and much more simplistic. All of us had different opinions of what to do, but looking at the consequences for yourself and for the organization comes to number one, what happens if you say no, and are you comfortable with that? Number two, a suggestion of ask them to put this directive in writing, and if they'll write it down, then you'll do it, but if they won't, you won't. And keep a paper trail, mile wide, and look for another job.
Thank you. If there's only one answer, and if it's very clear, it's not ethics.
Yeah.
That's one of my rules. It's, as I said at the start, it's about discretion. We're human beings. We see subtleties. We see all these sorts of things. If you want to be a robot, fine. Take a job as a robot, and then you don't have these problems. As I said, this case will be discussed at greater length and under the supervision of Dr. Mary Gentile on June 18th. I've got one more slide that I want to show now, which has to do with having these kinds of discussions, a decision process for ethical challenges. And I'm going to go through it quickly. It'll be there for you to look at it when you go to the website, and if you want to discuss it further. But this is a suggested process. This is usually the issue is about a wider group that has to come to a decision, and this in fact is adapted from a guide for discussions within hospitals and long-term care facilities. And the point is, practice at this stuff. Don't just wait for an actual situation. So starting with an identification of problems and dilemmas, which can be just at the individual level or the structural level within the organization, or it can be external to the organization, its impact elsewhere. Acknowledge feelings and drivers, gather facts, interpret linkages and patterns, and then review all that in light of the formal ethical frameworks that you might have within the area, but also the implicit ones, the kind of the general mores of your organization and standards of practice that you might have. Devise and assess alternatives, decide and act. And the classical thing is that you do it this way, and it doesn't happen that way, because inevitably there are points where you have to go back, especially when you get to the point of, okay, we've made our decision, all right, you do it. No, you do it, okay? But I don't want to do it, okay? Well, if nobody wants to do it, is there something wrong? Maybe we have to go back. Where did we miss? We didn't gather enough facts. We ought to talk to other people who've been in similar situations. We need to verify. What if we use the criterion of if they'll put it in writing, then we'll pay attention to it? Okay? There's various sorts of things that you'll think of along the way, so it'll be up and down pretty well every time. Ben, you wanted to say something about reviewing in light of ethical things about the reference points?
Yeah, just in our organization, we'd add a couple more like steps in there. Like somewhere in the middle, we'd have a spot where we call gather your reference points, or figure out what are the rules, laws, procedures, all that stuff. Figure it out, what applies to the situation. And of course, that's where you also put in your public sector values or organizational values in there, right? To that point, which value do we apply? And then at the very, very end, we also say that we want a reflection stage. We say we want to do ourselves a favor and set the commitment for, let's say, a week later, 6 months later, a year later, and review how did we do, right? I mean, we've been doing that for millions of years, right? Anyone ever do a New Year's resolution? Same thing.
Okay, so here we are. We just want to thank you for your attention and pose these questions. What does this all imply for you personally, for your own organization, and for the engagement of this organization, Performance and Planning Exchange, with the topic of ethics? My answer is thanks for your attention, and please become active members, not just passive members or not members at all, become active members of the PPX and of the Ethics Practitioners Association of Canada. And we welcome more dialogue if you're willing to let somebody else get the food first, but I think that's it. Walter?
Could we give a wonderful round of applause? This has been a very auspicious, I better take that microphone here. This has been a very auspicious start to a budding relationship we're going to have with the ethical practitioners over the next number of years. And I'm really pleased that, that it turned out. I guess we can all agree that this was a really informative and enlightening discussion. And we'd like to thank the three of you for your time, effort, and expertise in enlightening us on these areas. And we have a small token of our appreciation. We have little goodie bags here for you guys to thank you for that. So again, another round of applause.
Art just suggested that maybe this is the material for a half-day workshop next time around. Yeah? And as we were mapping out what we wanted to do, it looked like 3 hours to us, and then we cut it down to 1 hour. So, okay, good. So maybe we'll do that.
Thank you.
Could be worked into a learning event of ours next year.
Thank you.
Thanks again, folks. Enjoy your lunch.